One thing that I found interesting was Nadige's use of dialect in the play. Even if she had not described the characters and their origins, you could very easily tell from the sort of dialect in the character's speech that they were African American, and you could tell that George maybe wasn't African American because his dialect was slightly different than theirs, so that made you think he was maybe from an island. And I thought that was cool, and it made it more evident that the characters in the play were people of color. Two values that I thought were really stressed were intimacy, and the fact that the play itself is called Intimate Apparel, and Intimate Apparel obviously is what Esther makes, and when you show someone else this intimate apparel, it's someone you trust because it makes you vulnerable. So I thought it was really showing the vulnerability that intimacy can sometimes have. And the second value that I thought was stressed was social inequality. Obviously, it's very evident that Esther is a working class woman, and because of her race, she has to work very hard to move up in life, as well as George. And furthermore, there's gender inequality in the fact that even though George is the poor one, he's not the bread giver by any means. That's Esther, even when they're married. He goes out and lives a high life where she has to stay home and work, even as a wife. One thing I at first didn't understand was sort of the fascination that Nottage has with making sure that we know that all the materials used that Esther buys from Mr. Marks were so foreign. And after a little bit of research, I found that it was sort of to make the point that there's other nations outside of the United States at this time that did have a higher quality of life for those who weren't white, people of color, and it showed more progressive nations that exist. And I sort of thought that made Esther and have more hope that even though the play ends tragically and George leaves her, that there is hope, even with Mr. Marks possibly, of moving up in life. I thought that Intimate Apparel kind of resisted the social norms for African Americans at the time, given that the play itself is performed by African Americans. All the characters except Miss Van Buren were African American, and it really gave insight into the lives of African Americans at the time. And I think that's something that white audiences had never seen before, especially, I guess, African American love. So I thought this definitely challenged the ideas people had at the time of African Americans. And yes, I believe there are definitely stereotypes against African Americans in the world today. I think it's perpetuated by the fact that our white ancestors oppressed these African Americans, and now because of that, African Americans aren't that high in social status, yet we failed modern day people to realize that we put them there and we sort of discriminate. And in order to end this and to fight this, I believe the arts play a crucial role in talking with politicians and bringing these issues to light, and so we can do something about it. And two questions I had were, why do we never see the letters Esther writes? We always see the ones George supposedly wrote, but Esther's are never shown. It just says what they're going to be about, but never actually shows it, just like they showed George's. And the second question I had was, why did Esther agree to marry so quickly and not realize that something was going on earlier in their marriage since the first time that George asked for money?